Hello, welcome back to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Ben Chu, Economics and Business Editor of The Independent, and the Education Editor of The Sunday Times, Sian Griffths. Thank you very much for coming in to see us. Well, let's have a look at the front pages. First, let's start with The Sunday Times, which leads with its story that the Queen won't stand down for Prince Charles. The front page is dominated by an image of Her Majesty in pink. The Daily Mail says that hope is fading for the 7-year-old boy missing following the attack in Barcelona. The Daily Express has the same story. It says that the boy's injured British mother is desperately searching for her son. The Telegraph also covers the Barcelona attack, but focuses on plans to crack down on car and van rentals in its aftermath. And the Observer reports that leading experts on EU law have cast serious doubt on Theresa May's Brexit strategy. So let us begin. And let's start off with the Telegraph, because of course the investigation is continuing into how this Barcelona cell was able to operate for a whole year undetected, how it managed to do this, and looking at effectively its own incompetence in the way that it couldn't rent a larger van and do a lot more damage, Sian.
Yeah, but there's a very interesting story, the splash in the Sunday Telegraph, which I think in the wake of the terrible things that have happened in Barcelona, I think Britain is now looking at, can we crack down on car and van rentals? Because, of course, hired vehicles have been used in several of these attacks, London Bridge, Finsbury Park Mosque. And so the idea apparently is that information that's handed over to rental companies, including names, addresses and financial details, could actually be cross-checked against criminal watch lists very, very quickly. And then the car could be tracked if it is rented out, or even it could be stopped from being hired out to potential terrorists.
But then one of the concerns is not to infringe upon daily life, because obviously people still will be needing to rent these larger trucks for completely valid purposes.
Yeah, and that's the trade-off that ministers and we, the public, have to make. As you say, it will mean, if you hire a van, if they do implement this suggested scheme, it will mean a lot more delays, a lot more red tape. But my guess is that most people would be willing to make that trade-off if it meant even the small chance of a terrorist being able to get hold of an articulated van or lorry or something and causing the kind of carnage that we saw in Barcelona this week. If there's a minimal chance of doing it, I expect most people would be happy to do it. I mean, and the other issue is not really raised in this, is that barriers on public places like Ramblas, like Westminster, I suspect we're probably going to see a lot more of them, because that's actually simpler and quicker to implement than these kind of bureaucratic obstacles. So I suspect we'll hear a lot more about that as well in the coming days.
We are increasingly seeing those barriers, but in some areas it's just physically impossible to get them in, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can't put barriers across the whole town. You don't know, that's the problem. You never know where the terrorists are going to strike. I mean, there are barriers now across London Bridge, for instance. I cycle over London Bridge to work every day, and the barriers are very firmly there so that cars can't mount the curb and mow down pedestrians. But you know, you can't put them everywhere. You can't put them right across London or right across our capital cities. So.
And that doesn't help. Let's say attacks like in Finland, for example, where it's just a knife, I say just, but a knife attack, these kind of common day, everyday objects that people then use in these horrific ways.
Yeah, well, you know, security services are in the situation where they have to respond to the threat as they see it. And obviously the threat at the moment is the terrorists getting vans. So they have to respond to that. But as you say, things can evolve. There are other ways that they can attack innocent people. So it's a terrible challenge for the security forces, obviously.
And the Mail on Sunday focuses on this lost boy, the British 7-year-old boy, who we still don't know exactly what's happened to him. But my goodness, he's 7 years old. I've got a 9-year-old, and I know just what a child, how difficult it is. If he is missing, what on earth is going on? His parents absolutely distraught. I know his mother is very ill.
I mean, it's such a sad photograph, you know. There's this little boy and he's in his football shirt, his England shirt, and it's always the details that grab your heartstrings. I mean, he loves to dance. His mother, who was also injured, very ill in hospital, dad flying over from Australia, you know, what that family must be going through.
It's these stories, isn't it? When they pick up on these stories, on the victims, on the people who have been affected like this, it's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the details, as Sian mentioned, the father had a 22-hour flight over from Australia because obviously his wife and son were in Barcelona for a family wedding. Imagine what it must have been like not knowing what happened to your son for all that time. I mean, Just heartbreaking detail.
And this is what the Sunday papers are, of course, very, very good at. I mean, they have really gone and they found the stories of the people who've been affected in this terrible tragedy, and stories of heroism emerging, as well as stories of tragedy. So the Mail on Sunday has a British tourist, Harry Atwell, who actually risked his own safety. He stayed with a badly injured boy on Las Ramblas, even though he was told to move away, because the little boy reminded him of his own son. And so he kind of stayed kneeling with him. And the quotes are so moving, that was somebody's child, it could have been my child. Yeah, really sad.
Well, you just immediately think, though, don't you, there, but for the grace of God go I, it's something that so many of us have been to Las Ramblas. We've all been to these places, and it's just absolutely devastating when we see something like this happen.
And which is precisely why the terrorists choose these targets, Westminster, London Bridge, Las Ramblas. They know that the maximum way to multiply the shock is to choose places, as you say, that we've all been to, that we all might go to, or thinking of going to, because they want to terrorise. So, it's deliberate. It's absolutely deliberate.
Absolutely. Right, on to The Observer, where we are back focusing on Brexit. It doesn't take long, does it, to return to Brexit? Doubts are being cast on Theresa May's Brexit red line. Sian, what are they getting at here?
Yes, well, so this story, it's Sir Paul Jenkins. He's the former head of the government's legal services division, and he's absolutely pouring cold water on Theresa May's Brexit strategy. He said the policy on the legal implications of Brexit was foolish, and that if the UK wants close links with the single market, it will have to observe EU law in all but name, is what he's saying. And of course, it's only 2 weeks until David Davis actually enters a crucial phase of talks on the exit plans. So I see still chaos and confusion around our whole Brexit strategy, with a lot of people knocking it.
That's been such an issue, hasn't it? That's what people are so concerned about. It's the chaos, the lack of clarity, which I think is getting people a little bit, well, I say a little bit concerned, very concerned.
Yeah, well, so we had 2 position papers last week, one on the Customs Union and one on the Northern Ireland border. And I read them very closely because I obviously had to write about them. And I was just astonished by the lack of detail in them. And the Customs paper was 16 pages long. The Ireland one was, I think, about 30 pages long. And these are incredibly difficult challenges which they are grappling with. And to sort of give so little for people, the EU side or even journalists or analysts to work on, seems to me to be a terrible mistake, because it underlines how much either they haven't thought about them or how much they're keeping back about what they're going to try and implement, because there's a lot of detail.
What do you think it is? Do they not know, or are they afraid to share it?
David Davis said in an interview last week that he wants, it reflects creative ambiguity, or I think was the phrase he used, which is it's a sort of it's a nice sounding phrase, but I think personally that it's used to cover the fact that they don't actually have an idea about how they're going to confront these challenges, that they haven't properly grappled with the detail. And this is really the detail which is brought out in the Observer story. If you are going to have a customs union, a temporary interim customs union with the EU, which is like the one we have at the moment, someone has to oversee it. Some legal body has to oversee it. So who's that going to be? Well, the natural thing is the ECJ, but Theresa May said we will not be subject to the diktats or the supervision of the ECJ after 2019. So how can the customs union proposal work? This is what Sir Paul Jenkins is saying. To make the customs union bit work for the interim, you have to have a ECJ supervision, and if not that, it'll have to be some kind of fudge where the EU court and the UK courts cooperate. But this is the detail, and it's by no means clear that the EU side will agree to that. So these are all going to come into focus, I suspect, very, very in the coming days.
Absolutely. Sian, are you sensing a frustration from members of the public that this is just unravelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I cover education. I'm the education editor for the Sunday Times, and universities are absolutely panicking, because they have so many EU students, they have so many EU staff, they're so reliant on EU research funding, and they really do not know what will happen, in 2 years' time. So trying to make plans for the future is very, very difficult.
Right. Well, we're going to stay with The Observer, but it's a story that also The Telegraph is covering, and it's another Twitter spat. Ben, talk us through what's going on here.
Well, so Stephen Hawking, the eminent scientist, cosmologist, gave an opinion article to The Guardian on Friday, raising the alarm about privatisation of the health service and the general direction of health under the Conservatives. And as you say, there was a pushback on Twitter, which is the medium by which cabinet ministers now communicate with the people, it seems, by Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, yesterday. But he also wrote a column for the Sunday Telegraph, where he went into a bit more detail than he was allowed to with the 150-word limit on Twitter, talking about why Sir Stephen Hawking was entirely wrong to accuse the Tories of trying to privatise the NHS, pushing a pernicious falsehood that that's what they're doing, and also, interestingly, hitting back at the accusation which Stephen Hawking made against Jeremy Hunt that he was cherry-picking data when he argued that it's less safe to be in a hospital on weekends, which, as you remember, is one of the big disputes related to the junior doctors' strike. So quite a serious butting of heads between the two of them. As to who comes out on top, personally, I think Sir Stephen Hawking's over-egged it when he said they are privatising the NHS. There isn't really, you can't really find that in the data, but I think he was absolutely right to accuse Jeremy Hunt of cherry-picking data over the weekend effect. I mean, all the studies I've read suggest that it's the data is simply not there to make the kind of claims that Jeremy Hunt was making.
But when you've got someone like Stephen Hawking coming into an argument like this, you've got to think there might be a bit of a problem here, a bit of a misinformation, or just some kind of breakdown in PR.
Absolutely, but it is a sort of public relations disaster, isn't it? And personally, I just think Jeremy Hunt going on Twitter and, attacking Stephen Hawking on Twitter, it's just so ludicrous. It's just not the way we expect our ministers to behave. I don't want really serious policy discussions played out on Twitter with the use of, to instead of the word to. And of course, once he did that, social media users have absolutely piled in. So now we've got doctors and scientists mocking Hunt on Twitter for taking on the world's most famous scientist. There's becoming a sort of a Twitter spat,
comedy, a meme. You'd think we'd learn not to use. Don't go near Twitter, surely.
Well, they think it's a more direct way to communicate. I think they said the last general election where Labour did so well, it turns out in retrospect, because of social media. I think ministers kind of think, well, we've got to get our message out there, and we've obviously seen how Donald Trump uses Twitter, which is not a good example, not a good way of using it in my view, but it is a direct way of communicating. So maybe they're making a trade-off. Although people will mock and ridicule him, maybe at least it's a direct way of communicating.
Right, another way of communicating the royal family, we've got the Sunday Times saying that the Queen will not stand down for Prince Charles. Well, no real surprise there, though, is there?
Well, I think there has been a lot of talk that she might, that she might, and she's very elderly and she's very amazing and very wonderful, but that she might want to not just step back from some duties which she's already doing, but actually have a sort of regency arrangement where Prince Charles takes over. And this is a story from our royal correspondent Roy Nicker, making very clear that nobody is planning for a regency, neither Buckingham Palace nor Clarence House. And that this pledge that the Queen made on her 21st birthday, I declare that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service, that she intends to completely honour that, even, up to her 95th birthday, or, on and on into the future. But there is, of course, the idea that she will be delegating and relegating some duties, more duties to Prince William, to Charles, and so on.
Well, we're seeing the younger royals take up more of an active role, obviously, and we like, the members of the public, they seem to like that. They engage with the younger royals, but in terms of the Queen actually stepping down, it's very difficult to fathom. It
is quite difficult to fathom, and I think we were talking about Brexit. With Brexit, a big constitutional moment for the UK, and the issues around Charles and Camilla. I can imagine the government would be, the last thing they'd want is this stalwart, massively respected sovereign to formally, invoke the 1937 Regency Act and step back. It's just not the right time for it, providing, as it seems to be, her her aides are saying her health is perfectly up to it and she has no intention to do it, I suspect a lot of ministers and the Prime Minister will be breathing a sigh of relief over that. That's the last thing they need is
some stability, some stability in the country. Let's finish with the Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, the child genius. Well, Sian, I'm going to start with you on this one. How abnormal? Well, how different is this? Because I can't imagine a child like this. It's incredible.
I don't know if you watched it, but it was extraordinary to watch. Little Rahul, he was amazing. I mean, he was. I was watching it with my children. They're like, he's like a little 50-year-old in a child's body, Mum. But he was so composed. He was so clever. I mean, he memorised things so well. Of course, the debate about child genius every time it's on, is. Are these the children? Is it the children who want to take part in these programs, or is it pushy parents? And watching Rahul's family, I mean, his dad was so behind him. Rahul lifted the trophy at the end, and his dad lifted it away from him and lifted it too. But you also had that sense that this was a family kind of completely behind this child, willing him on, but not in a negative way, in a very positive way. And my son, who was watching it with me, said to me, "Oh, the family that competes together wins together." And it was like, we always say, is this good for these children to be put in the spotlight in this way and put under this pressure? But life is pressure, life is competition. And if you go to the Far East and you see the tiger parents, you're like, these are the children that our children will be competing against in a global economy. We have to stop being so liberal and wishy-washy about life, really. It's kind of where I was coming from. But I loved it, and I loved Rahul, and I loved his parents. I loved the whole thing.
The family
was brilliant.
Great characters, aren't they? You've got to say.
Well, I haven't watched it, but I read the interview, and I came to it with a bit of a jaded eye, thinking, they must be punishing him, they must be sort of tiger parents. And I read the interview, and this just sounded the nicest possible family, not pushy, but encouraging and pretty modest, humble background. Actually, they're not particularly, well off. And I just really warmed to them just from reading the article. So maybe I should go back and watch it.
But this isn't. It's not. I just can't imagine any child of that age just sitting down and getting on with this kind of level of work. There's some pushing from the parents, surely.
Well, I think they're definitely encouraged to do it, but also the difficulty of the questions, what is the freezing point of water in degrees Kelvin? Well, I don't know.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That's it for the papers. Thanks to Ben Chu and Sian Griffths. Just a reminder, we'll take a look at tomorrow's front pages this evening at 10:30 and 11:30 here on BBC News. Thank you very much.